The place cards had been laid out on the morning room table, each one written in Euleria's own hand, each name penned in the same elegant, slanting script that governed every detail of life at Thornhollow Park. There were 40 of them, arranged in careful rows that mirrored the seating plan for the midsummer ball. Sir Anne stood at the edge of the table, her fingers still damp from arranging the hothouse flowers her stepmother had ordered from the glasshouse at dawn. She had not been asked to check the cards. She had simply needed to pass through the room on her way to the linen closets, but her eyes found the table, and the table told her everything she needed to know. Lavinia's card sat at the centre of the principal table, positioned between Lord Addington and Sir Colvan Marsh. Two of the most eligible men expected to attend. The placement was not subtle, it was a declaration. Around Lavinia, the other cards fanned out in descending order of social value, each one a calculated move in the campaign that had consumed Eularia for the past 3 seasons, the campaign to marry her daughter to a fortune. Sir Anne's own card was not at the principal table. It was not at any table. She found it at last, set apart from the others on the corner of a side cabinet, placed beside the cards from Mrs. Hewitt, the paid companion of Lady Roche, and old Nance Burridge, who was deaf in both ears and attended every gathering in the county because no one had the heart to stop inviting her. Saren picked up her own card and held it in the light. Miss Calloway, not even her Christian name. Just the surname, stripped of warmth, stripped of identity. She was to sit with the companions and the charity cases, visible enough to satisfy propriety, but invisible enough to make no impression on anyone who mattered. She set the card down and smoothed her apron. She did not allow her face to change. She had learned that trick long ago, the art of keeping her expression as still and unreadable as pond water. It was a necessary skill in a house where every flicker of emotion was catalogued and used. The door opened behind her, and the scent of jasmine and powder entered the room a full 3 seconds before Eularia herself appeared. Her stepmother was a tall woman, handsome rather than beautiful, with pale hair swept up in an immaculate arrangement, and a mouth that smiled frequently, and meant it never. She was dressed for a morning of final preparations, her posture as rigid and purposeful as a general surveying a battlefield. "Ah, Saren, good. You have seen the arrangements." "I have." "Ha." Eularia moved to the table and adjusted a card that did not need adjusting. Her eye swept the rows with satisfaction. "You understand your position this evening." It was not a question. Saren understood. She had understood for 3 seasons now. Ever since her father's death had transferred every particle of authority in this house to the woman he had married 18 years before he died. Saren was 24 years old. She was the daughter of the late Viscount Calloway, the elder child of his first and most beloved wife. By every law of custom and decency, she should have been the one seated at the center of that table. She should have been the one being launched into society with care and expense and ambition. Instead, she was the ghost of Thornhollow, the sister who stayed in the background. The one no gentleman had ever been given the chance to court because Eularia had made certain of it. 3 seasons Saren had attended balls and dinners and card parties, always in last year's gown, always seated at the edges, always introduced as an afterthought. "This is my stepdaughter. She prefers quiet company." The message was clear, and it had been received. No gentleman of means would waste his time pursuing a girl whose own family treated her as furniture. "Lavinia will need you to manage her train during the first 2 dances," Eularia continued, her voice pleasant and utterly immovable. "After that, you may sit. Mrs. Hewitt is very agreeable. You will not lack for conversation, of course." Eularia studied her for a moment, searching for cracks. Finding none, she gave a small nod and left the room, the jasmine scent trailing behind her like a silk ribbon pulled through a closing door. Saren stood alone in the morning room with the 40 place cards in the silence. She picked up her card once more and looked at it. Miss Calloway. She wanted to tear it in half. She wanted to walk out of this house and never return. But she could not. Not yet. There was something she needed here, something hidden in the locked study at the end of the ground floor corridor, and until she found it she would endure. She would sit beside Mrs. Peria, Hewitt and old Nance Burridge. She would manage Lavinia's train. She would be the ghost. But ghosts, she reminded herself as she set the card down for the last time, have a way of being seen by those who know how to look. The Midsummer Ball at Thornhollow Park was the event of the county calendar, and Eularia had spent 4 months and a considerable sum ensuring that this year's would be remembered. The great hall had been transformed with banks of white roses and trailing ivy, hundreds of candles blazing from every sconce and chandelier, and a string quartet imported from London at an expense that would have made the late Viscount's eyes water. The guests arrived in a steady stream of carriages, the gravel drive crunching under wheel after wheel as the summer twilight deepened into a warm violet dusk. Saren watched from the upper landing as the hall below filled with colour and noise and laughter. She was dressed in a gown of dove-grey silk, simple and well-made, but clearly 2 seasons old. Her dark hair was pinned up without ornament. She wore no jewellery. Beside her, reflected in the tall landing mirror, she could see Lavinia descending the main staircase in a cascade of ivory satin and seed pearls. Her golden hair dressed with tiny white rosebuds, her face luminous with excitement and the particular confidence that comes from knowing every eye in the room is turning towards you. Lavinia was beautiful. Saren had never resented her for it. Her half-sister was 19 and kind in the careless, unthinking way of people who have never had to fight for anything. She did not understand the machinery that operated beneath the surface of their household. She did not know what her mother had done or was doing. She simply existed in the light, because the light was where Eularia had placed her. Saren descended the stairs after her sister had reached the bottom and been swallowed by a cluster of admirers. No one watched her come down. She made her way to the small gilt chair that had been set beside Mrs. Hewitt, a kind-faced woman who smelled of lavender, and immediately began a meandering account of her cat's digestive troubles. The first 2 hours passed as they always did. Saren managed Lavinia's train for the opening dance, then retired to her chair. She watched the room with the quiet, practiced attention of someone who has spent years observing from the margins. She noted who danced with whom, who whispered behind their fans, who drank too much of the punch. She saw Eularia circulating with lethal grace, guiding Lavinia from one eligible partner to the next, her smile never faltering, her strategy never resting. Then the room changed. It began at the doors. A subtle shift in the current of conversation, a turning of heads, a ripple of whispers that spread across the hall like wind through a wheat field. Saren felt it before she saw its cause. Mrs. Hewitt stopped talking about her cat. Even old Nance Burridge, who could not hear thunder, sat up straighter. He stood in the doorway as if he had been carved there. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in black evening clothes that were so perfectly cut. They seemed less like a garment and more like an extension of his bearing. His hair was dark, almost black, and his face possessed the kind of severe, angular beauty that made people forget what they were saying mid-sentence. But it was his eyes that arrested the room. They were a pale, startling grey, and they swept the hall with the calm, unhurried assessment of a man who owned more land than some countries. Hadrian Voss, the Duke of Ashworth. The whispers became a tide. He has not been seen in society for 3 years, not since his sister died. Why is he here? Who invited him? Saren saw Eularia's face across the room and watched a transformation that would have been fascinating if it were not so calculating. Surprise gave way to recognition, recognition to opportunity, and opportunity to action, all in the space of 3 heartbeats. Her stepmother's hand found Lavinia's arm and steered her gently, almost imperceptibly, into the Duke's line of sight. But the Duke was not looking at Lavinia. He was not looking at any of the young women who stood like jewels in the center of the room, positioned and polished for exactly this kind of moment. His grey eyes moved past them, past the dancers, past the principal tables, past the clusters of eligible beauty. They traveled to the far wall, to the row of small gilt chairs where the companions and the charity cases sat. They found Saren. She felt the impact of his gaze like a physical thing, a sudden pressure in her chest, a catch in her breathing. He held her eyes for 1 second, 2 seconds, 3. Then he moved. He walked across the ballroom floor with a stride that was unhurried but absolute, the crowd parting before him without being asked, conversations dying in his wake. Every person in the room watched. Euleria's hand tightened on Lavinia's arm until her knuckles turned white. He stopped in front of Saren's chair. Up close, the severity of his features was tempered by something she had not expected. Not warmth exactly, but a weariness so deep it bordered on tenderness. He was a man who had been exhausted by the world and was looking for something he had not yet found. "Miss Calloway," he said. His voice was low and clear, carrying just enough to reach the nearest onlookers and no further. Saren's mouth went dry. He knew her name. Not Lavinia's name. Hers. "Your Grace," she managed, her voice steady by sheer force of will. "I believe the next dance is a waltz," he said. "Will you do me the honor?" It was not a question that could be refused. It was not a question that had ever been asked of her, not once in 3 seasons, and to footnote. The silence in the room was so complete she could hear the candle flames guttering in their sconces. She rose from her small gilt chair. She took his offered hand. His fingers closed around hers, firm and warm, and he led her onto the floor as if she were the only person in the room. The waltz began. His hand settled at her waist with a confidence that was neither possessive nor tentative. He held her at the proper distance, his grey eyes looking directly into hers. He did not glance around the room. He did not acknowledge the hundreds of staring faces. He danced as if the 2 of them were entirely alone. "You are wondering why," he said, after several bars of silence. The thought had crossed my mind. A faint ghost of amusement moved across his mouth. It was not quite a smile. It was the memory of what a smile used to feel like. "I was told," he said, "that this household contained the most remarkable young woman in the county. I came to see if it was true." Saren's heart tripped. "You must mean my sister Lavinia is considered the beauty of the season." "I did not say beautiful," he replied. "I said remarkable. The music carried them through a turn. His hand was steady. His gaze did not waver. Around them, the room buzzed with an electricity that was almost audible. "Who told you?" she asked, unable to stop herself. "A man, I trust. He knew your father." The mention of her father was so unexpected, so piercingly intimate in this glittering public setting, that Saren nearly stumbled. His arm tightened fractionally, steadying her, and for a brief moment they were close enough that she could smell cedar and night air and something warm beneath. "Forgive me," he said, and his voice held the first note of genuine softness she had heard. "I did not mean to cause you pain." "You did not," she lied. The waltz ended. He released her with a small, precise bow. The room erupted into a murmur that was somewhere between scandal and fascination. He did not ask Lavinia to dance. He did not ask anyone else. He spoke briefly with the host, refused a glass of champagne, and left within the hour, his carriage vanishing into the summer night as suddenly as it had arrived. Saren returned to her gilt chair on legs that felt as if they belonged to someone else. Mrs. Hewitt was staring at her with an expression of pure astonishment. Even old Nance Burridge was agog. Across the room, Euleria's face was a mask of composure, but her eyes burned with a fury that Saren recognized. It was the same look she wore when any element of her carefully constructed world dared to move without her permission. That night, lying in her narrow bed in the smallest bedroom at the top of the back stairs, Saren stared at the ceiling and replayed every word he had spoken. "A man, I trust. He knew your father." It was impossible. Her father had been dead for 2 years. His friends, his colleagues, his entire world had been systematically dismantled by Eularia and her allies. Who remained who would speak of him? And to a duke, no less. And why her? Why cross an entire ballroom, past every beauty in the county, to ask a girl in a 2-season-old grey dress to waltz? She pressed her palms against her eyes. She could still feel the warmth of his hand at her waist, the low, clear sound of his voice, the startling directness of his gaze. He had looked at her as if he could see through the grey dress, through the composed face, through the 3 years of careful, quiet endurance, and had found something underneath that interested him more than anything the glittering surface of that room had to offer. It thrilled her. It also terrified her, because attention, any attention, was dangerous. And the attention of the wealthiest duke in England was a kind of danger she had no experience navigating, what Saren could not have known, and what no one in that ballroom would have believed, was that Hadrian Voss had not come to Thornhollow on a whim. 6 months earlier, in the book-lined study of his London residence, a letter had arrived. It was from a man named Professor Alden Greaves, a retired Fellow of the Royal Society, and one of the few people in the world whose correspondence the Duke still opened with interest. Greaves had been a mentor to Hadrian's late father and a friend of the family for decades. He was also, as the letter revealed, an old and cherished friend of the late Viscount Calloway. The letter described a crime so quietly devastating that it had gone entirely unnoticed by the wider world. The Viscount's elder daughter, Margaret Saren Calloway, had been systematically stripped of her inheritance by her stepmother. The original will had left the family estate and the bulk of the fortune to Saren, with generous provision for Lavinia and a life interest in the house for Eularia. But a revised will had appeared, one that placed everything under Euleria's sole control and reduced Saren's share to a token annual sum that had never been paid. Greaves had tried to intervene. He had written to the solicitor who handled the estate, a man named Kroll, and received a curt reply stating that all was in order. He had written to Eularia and received no reply at all. He had even written to Saren, but suspected the letters had been intercepted. He was old and infirm and could not travel. So he had turned to the one man he believed had both the power and the character to act. "Your late father," Greaves wrote, "once told me that the measure of a man is not what he builds for himself, but what he restores to those who have been robbed. I ask you to look into this matter, not as a favor to me, but as an act of justice for a young woman who has no one left to speak on her behalf." Hadrian had read the letter twice, then set it aside and stared at the fire for a long time. He had been living in a kind of suspended grief since the death of his younger sister Rosanna. 3 years earlier, Rosanna had been his closest companion, his confidant, the one person who could make him laugh. She had died of a fever that had come on suddenly and taken her within 5 days. He had not attended a ball, a dinner, or a single social gathering since. He had retreated into the management of his vast estates, into silence, into a cold, efficient solitude that his staff mistook for strength and his mother's friends called tragic. Greaves's letter had pierced that solitude, not because of the injustice itself, though it offended every principle he held, but because of the portrait it painted of the young woman at its center. A woman enduring without complaint. A woman maintaining her dignity in the face of deliberate cruelty. A woman who had been robbed of everything and had not broken. He had instructed his own solicitor to investigate. The findings confirmed every detail and added several that were worse. The revised will bore the signature of a witness who had died 3 months before the date on the document. The solicitor Kroll had a history of questionable dealings and had since left the country. Eulalia had used the stolen inheritance to fund Lavinia's 3 London seasons while keeping Sarin in a state of genteel deprivation that stopped just short of what the neighbours might notice. But there was one element that Hadrian's investigators could not resolve: the original will. Greaves believed a copy existed, kept by the Viscount himself in his private study at Thornhollow. If it could be found, it would be the proof that the revised will was a forgery. Without it, the case rested on circumstantial evidence, compelling but not conclusive. The midsummer ball had been his opportunity. He had secured an invitation through a mutual acquaintance, knowing that Eulalia would never refuse the social coup of having the Duke of Ashworth under her roof. He had come to observe, to assess, to begin the quiet, patient work of uncovering the truth. He had not expected what happened when he walked into that ballroom. He had not expected the sight of her sitting in that ridiculous gilt chair at the edge of the room, dressed in a gown that was clearly chosen to diminish her face composed with a stillness that he recognized in his own mirror. He had not expected the fierce, irrational certainty that overtook him, the absolute knowledge that Greaves had been right, that this woman was exactly what he had described, and that she was in danger. And he had not expected, when he took her hand for the waltz, the sharp and disorienting sensation that something inside him, something that had been frozen since Rosanna's death, had begun without his permission to thaw. He sat in his carriage as it carried him back to Ashworth Hall through the warm summer darkness, and he pressed his fingers against his temples. He had a plan. He had come with a purpose. The purpose was justice, not sentiment, but the memory of her eyes, steady and guarded and luminous with an intelligence she had been trained to hide, would not leave him. And the memory of her voice, calm and precise even as her pulse beat visibly at her throat, followed him all the way home and into a night of restless, unaccustomed sleeplessness. He had crossed a ballroom. He had the unsettling feeling that he had also crossed a line from which there would be no returning. The consequences arrived before breakfast. Sarin was in the still room, sorting dried lavender into muslin sachets for the linen presses, when the door opened and Eulalia entered. Her stepmother did not sit. She stood in the center of the small room, her hands clasped at her waist, her face arranged in the expression Sarin had come to think of as the porcelain mask, pleasant, composed, and absolutely lethal. "You made quite an impression last evening." Sarin's hands continued their work. The lavender crumbled between her fingers, releasing its dusty sweetness. "I was asked to dance," she said. "I could not refuse a duke." "No," Eulalia agreed. "You could not. But you could have been less conspicuous about it. You could have been gracious and forgettable. Instead, the entire county is talking about nothing else this morning." She let the words settle. "Lady Roche has already sent a note asking whether there is an understanding between you and Ashworth, an understanding about a girl who owns 2 good dresses." Sarin said nothing. She had learned years ago that silence was the only weapon Eulalia could not disarm. Her stepmother moved closer, lowering her voice to the intimate, confiding tone she used when she wanted her words to cut deepest. "I have given you a home, Sarin. I have kept you fed and clothed and sheltered when I had no obligation to do so. Your father's estate barely covers its own costs. I have borne the burden of this household out of loyalty to his memory. And this is how you repay me, by making a spectacle of yourself and embarrassing your sister." Lavinia did not seem embarrassed. Sarin said quietly, "She seemed happy for me. Lavinia is a child. She does not understand the damage you have done. Every eye that was watching you was an eye that was not watching her. Every whisper about you was a conversation that should have been about her future. You have stolen her evening." The injustice of the accusation was so breathtaking that Saren had to close her eyes for a moment. She had stolen nothing. A man she had never met had walked across a room and asked her to dance. That was all. But in Eularia's calculus, any light that fell on Saren was light taken from Lavinia, and light taken from Lavinia was a direct threat to the only project that mattered. "It will not happen again," Eularia said, and her voice carried the weight of an edict. "I will ensure it. You will attend only those occasions I select. You will wear what I provide. And you will not place yourself in the path of any gentleman of rank. Is that understood?" Saren met her stepmother's gaze. The porcelain mask stared back at her, smooth and impenetrable. She thought of the locked study at the end of the ground floor corridor. She thought of her father's desk, which she had not been permitted to approach since his death. She thought of the will, the real will, the one she was certain existed somewhere in that room. "It is understood," she said. "Good." Eularia turned to leave, then paused at the door. "One more thing. The household accounts need attention. Mrs. Calder has been complaining about the butcher's bills. I would like you to take over the management of the kitchen ledgers. It will give you something useful to occupy your time." It was a masterstroke, and they both knew it. The kitchen ledgers were an endless grinding task that would consume Saren's mornings, which were the only hours she had to herself. It would keep her buried in columns of figures, with no time to think, no time to plan, and no time to search for what she needed. Eularia had not merely punished her, she had tightened the walls of her cage. Saren spent the days that followed hunched over a desk in the housekeeper's sitting room, poring over bills and receipts and tallies that Mrs. Calder, the cook, kept in a state of cheerful chaos. But the ledgers told their own story, one that Eularia had not intended her to read. The household spending was enormous. Entire categories of expense existed solely to fund Lavinia's wardrobe, Eularia's London trips, and the constant entertaining that was the engine of the husband-hunting campaign. Saren saw her father's fortune bleeding away in silk and champagne and hired carriages, and she understood with a cold clarity that time was not on her side. At this rate, there would be nothing left to reclaim, even if she found the original will. The isolation deepened. Eularia had spoken to the senior staff. Saren found herself excluded from meals with the family, eating instead in the small parlor adjoining the housekeeper's room. Invitations to local gatherings arrived addressed only to Eularia and Lavinia. When visitors called, Saren was sent upstairs. She was being erased, methodically and completely, from the social life of the household. Lavinia, to her credit, noticed. She appeared in the housekeeper's sitting room one morning with a plate of biscuits and a troubled expression. "Mama says you prefer to eat alone," she said, setting the plate on the desk. "But that is not true, is it?" Saren looked at her half-sister, at the open, guileless face that was so like their father's, and felt a surge of affection so painful it took her breath away. Lavinia was not the enemy. She was another piece on the board, moved by hands she could not see. "I am busy with the accounts," Saren said, managing a smile. "It is easier to eat while I work." Lavinia sat down on the edge of a chair. She looked at the stacked ledgers, the ink-stained blotter, the cramped little room with its single window. "You should not be doing this," she said. "You are not a servant. Someone must do it, but not you." She hesitated, then spoke in a rush. "Saren, the Duke of Ashworth, did he truly seek you out? Did he truly ask only you to dance?" "He did." Lavinia's face broke into a smile that was so genuine, so entirely free of jealousy, that Saren's eyes burned. "I am glad," she said simply. "You deserve to be seen." "Mama does not think so, but I do. I always have." She squeezed Saren's hand and left, taking the warmth of the room with her. That evening, a letter arrived at Thornhollow Park. It was addressed to Saren. and it bore a seal she did not recognize. Eulalia intercepted it, as she intercepted all correspondence. Saren did not learn of its existence until 3 days later, when Lavinia mentioned it in passing over the breakfast table. "Oh, did you receive the Duke's letter? The footman told me one arrived for you with the Ashworth crest. Was it an invitation?" The silence that followed was absolute. Eulalia's teacup paused halfway to her lips. Saren's gaze moved to her stepmother's face and found it frozen in an expression that was no longer porcelain but stone. "I received no letter," Saren said carefully. Eulalia set down her cup. "There was a letter," she said, her voice light and practiced. "I assumed it was a general courtesy. A thank you for the hospitality of the ball. I replied on behalf of the household. There was nothing in it that required your personal attention." The lie was so smooth, so effortlessly delivered, that anyone who did not know Eulalia might have believed it. But Saren knew her. She knew the precise calibration of that casual tone, the practiced ease of that dismissive gesture. The letter had not been a general courtesy, and Eulalia's reply, whatever it contained, had not been written on Saren's behalf. Something cold and heavy settled in Saren's stomach. The Duke had reached out, and Eulalia had slammed the door shut. Whatever chance that letter represented, whatever opportunity or lifeline it might have contained, it was gone. Intercepted, answered, and buried before Saren even knew it existed. She looked down at her plate and said nothing, but beneath the table her hands were shaking. Not with anger, with the slow, burning realization that she was running out of time, that the walls were closing in, and that the only person who had shown any interest in reaching her had just been told, in her name, to stay away. 3 weeks after the ball, the Dowager Duchess of Ashworth came to call at Thornhollow Park. She arrived without warning in a carriage of dark green lacquer drawn by 4 matched greys, and the household was thrown into a state of genteel panic. Eulalia, caught in her morning dress with her hair not yet fully pinned, performed the fastest transformation in the history of English country hospitality. Within 20 minutes she was in the drawing-room, immaculately dressed, presiding over hastily assembled tea things as if she had been expecting the visit all along. The dowager was a woman of 70, small and straight-backed, with silver hair, arranged in an elegant chignon, and a pair of sharp blue eyes that missed absolutely nothing. Her name was Dorothea, and she had been a celebrated beauty in her youth, a formidable political hostess in her middle years, and was now in her widowhood the most respected and feared voice in the county. She did not make social calls lightly. When she appeared at your door it meant something. Eulalia was all warmth and deference. "Your Grace, what an unexpected pleasure. May I present my daughter Lavinia?" Lavinia curtsied prettily. The dowager regarded her with a brief, appraising glance that was not unkind but was clearly not the purpose of the visit. "Charming," she said. "And your other daughter, Miss Calloway, I should like to meet her as well." The request landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Eulalia's smile flickered for the barest instant. "Saren is occupied with household matters this morning, Your Grace. She is something of a recluse, I am afraid. She prefers her books to company. Then she and I shall get along famously," the dowager said, her voice pleasant and completely immovable. "I insist." There was no refusing a dowager duchess. Saren was sent for. She arrived in the drawing-room still wearing her ink-stained apron, which she pulled off and folded hastily behind her back. She curtsied, aware of Eulalia's rigid smile and the dowager's penetrating gaze. "Miss Calloway." The dowager extended her hand, and when Saren took it, the old woman held on for a moment longer than courtesy required, studying her face with an intensity that was almost unsettling. "You have your father's eyes," she said quietly. "I knew him, years ago. A brilliant man. We corresponded about Cicero. You knew my father, Saren said, and her voice came out smaller than she intended. I did. He was a friend, and he spoke of you often. His clever daughter, he called you his Saren. The use of her Christian name, spoken with such easy familiarity and warmth, was like a hand reaching through the wall Eulalia had built and touching her directly on the heart. Saren felt the dangerous prickle of tears and fought it back with every ounce of control she possessed. Eulalia intervened smoothly. You are too kind, Your Grace. Saren has always been a quiet girl. Her interests are domestic. The dowager's blue eyes moved to Eulalia, and something in them hardened. Domestic, she repeated, tasting the word as if it were slightly rancid. How interesting. Her father told me she had read the entirety of Livy by the age of 15. In Latin, of course. That is rather more than domestic. The silence that followed was excruciating. Lavinia looked from her mother to the dowager with wide, confused eyes. Eulalia's smile had become something fixed and terrible. The dowager turned back to Saren. My dear, I wonder if you might walk with me in the garden. I find that drawing rooms make me dull, and I should very much like to see your father's roses. I am told he planted a remarkable collection. Eulalia could not refuse. The dowager was not asking permission. She was informing the room of what was about to happen. Saren followed the old woman out through the French doors and into the sunlit garden, leaving behind a silence so thick it could have been sliced. They walked slowly along the gravel path that wound through the rose beds, the dowager leaning lightly on a silver-handled cane that she plainly did not need. The roses were in full bloom, their scent heavy in the warm air. Saren's father had planted every one of them, and she knew each variety by name. I will be direct, the dowager said at last. It is the privilege of the old. My son came to your ball 3 weeks ago. He danced with you. He has spoken of little else since. She paused. You should understand that this is remarkable. Hadrian has spoken of little at all since his sister's death. He has been a closed book, a locked room. And now suddenly, he is not. She stopped walking and turned to face Saren. What did you say to him? Nothing of consequence, Your Grace. We spoke only a few words during the dance. The dowager's eyes narrowed. He says you reminded him of Rosanna. Not in appearance. In quality. He says you have the same stillness, the same way of seeing things that others do not see. She tilted her head. He also says he wrote to you and received a most discouraging reply. Saren's breath caught. What did the reply say? The dowager watched her closely. It said that you were grateful for the honor of the dance, but that you were not receiving correspondence from gentlemen and wished to be left in peace. It was polite, correct, and entirely without warmth. Hadrian was puzzled. He said it did not sound like the woman he had danced with. The ground seemed to tilt beneath Saren's feet. Eulalia had not merely intercepted the letter. She had replied in Saren's name, manufacturing a rejection designed to close the door permanently. I did not write that letter, Saren said. The words were out before she could stop them, and once spoken, they could not be taken back. She pressed her hand to her mouth, horrified by her own recklessness. The dowager was very still. She regarded Saren with an expression that was no longer curious, but fierce, the expression of a woman who had navigated 60 years of aristocratic politics and could recognize a trapped creature when she saw one. No, she said softly. I did not think you had. She took Saren's arm and began to walk again, her grip firm and reassuring. Tell me nothing you do not wish to tell me, child. But know that I have eyes, and I can see what is happening in this house. A young woman of education and quality reduced to a household drudge. A stepmother who hoards every advantage for her own child. A father's legacy that seems to have vanished into thin air. She paused by a climbing rose that had wound itself around an old iron arch. I know the shape of injustice, even when it wears a charming dress and serves excellent tea. Saren could not speak. pawns, the directness, the sheer unexpected grace of this woman's perception undid something inside her that had been holding firm for years. She did not cry, but she came very close. The dowager patted her arm. "I am going to invite you to Ashworth Hall. Not your stepmother, not your sister, you, for a week of quiet study and conversation. I have a library that your father would have wept to see, and I have a son who needs to remember how to be a human being. You would be doing us both a great service." "Eulalia will not permit it," Seren said, her voice barely audible. The dowager smiled, and there was something of her son's severity in it, tempered by a warmth that was entirely her own. "My dear girl," she said, "I am the Dowager Duchess of Ashworth. Eulalia Calloway does not permit or deny me anything. The invitation will be issued in writing, formally and publicly. She will have no choice but to accept, unless she wishes to insult the most powerful family in 3 counties. And I do not think she is quite that foolish." She squeezed Seren's arm. "You are not alone, child. You may have been, but you are not any longer. Remember that." They returned to the drawing room. The dowager drank her tea, complimented Lavinia on her complexion, and departed with the serene, unhurried grace of a woman who had accomplished exactly what she came to do. She left behind a household in turmoil and a stepmother whose porcelain mask showed for the first time a crack. That night Seren lay in her narrow bed and stared at the ceiling. But this time the feeling in her chest was not dread. It was something lighter, more fragile, more dangerous than dread. It was hope. She could not rely on the Duke or his mother. She could not place her fate in anyone's hands but her own. The invitation to Ashworth Hall, if it came, would take her away from Thornhollow for a week, but it would also prove something that Eulalia had spent 3 years trying to make her doubt: that she was not invisible, that she was not forgotten, that the world beyond these walls still had a place for her. And before she left, she would find the will. Whatever it took. We will take a very short break. If you do not want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel. The invitation arrived 4 days later, written on heavy cream paper and sealed with the Ashworth crest. It was addressed to Miss Margaret Seren Calloway, care of Thornhollow Park. The use of her full name was deliberate. It was a recognition, a restoration, issued in ink before it could be issued in fact. Eulalia read it at the breakfast table, her face perfectly controlled. Lavinia clapped her hands. "How wonderful! Seren, you must go. What will you wear?" Eulalia set the letter down. Her fingertips rested on its edge as if she were considering whether to tear it in half. She was weighing her options. A refusal would be an insult to the most powerful family in the county, an insult that would close doors for Lavinia, as surely as it would close them for Seren. An acceptance meant losing control of Seren for a full week, sending her into the orbit of a family that clearly had an interest in her, an interest that Eulalia could neither direct nor contain. "How generous," Eulalia said finally, her voice sweet and brittle. "Of course you must go, Seren. It would be churlish to refuse such a distinguished invitation." The graciousness was so transparently false that even Lavinia looked uncomfortable. But the acceptance had been given, spoken aloud in front of witnesses, and it could not be taken back. Seren inclined her head. "Thank you," she said. And beneath the table her hands gripped each other until her knuckles turned white. She used the 3 days before the carriage arrived with every ounce of cunning and patience she possessed. Bullock's study at the end of the ground floor corridor had been her father's private room. Since his death, Eulalia had kept it sealed. She carried the key on a chain around her neck, tucked beneath her bodice, and the room was never opened in Serene's presence. Seren believed it held the original will, the document that would prove the forgery and restore everything that had been taken from her. She had spent months looking for a way in, but now, With the Ashworth invitation burning like a coal in her chest, she felt the old calculus shifting. If Eulalia suspected anything, she might destroy the will while Saren was away. This could be her last chance. On the second night, Saren waited until the house was asleep. She lay in her bed, fully dressed, listening to the sounds of Thornhollow settling into its nightly stillness. The creak of old timber, the distant chime of the long-case clock in the hall, the soft footsteps of the night footman making his rounds. She counted the chimes. 10, 11, midnight. She rose and moved to her door, opening it with exquisite care. She carried no candle. She knew this house by touch, by memory, by the map she had built in her mind over 2 years of silent, patient observation. She knew which floorboards creaked. She knew the rhythm of the night footman's rounds, the 12-minute circuit that took him from the main hall through the ground floor and back. She descended the narrow back stairs, her stockinged feet silent on the worn wood. She moved through the darkness with a control that was almost supernatural, each step placed with deliberate precision, her breathing shallow and even. The study door appeared before her, a darker rectangle in the dark corridor. She knelt and examined the lock by touch. It was a lever lock, old but well maintained. She had prepared for this. In the bottom of her sewing basket, hidden beneath rolls of thread, she kept a set of small tools that had belonged to her father. He had been an amateur locksmith, a hobby that had amused his scholarly friends. He had taught Saren the basics as a child, laughing as her small fingers fumbled with the picks. A useless skill for a gentleman's daughter, he had said. But you never know. She drew the picks from her pocket and inserted them into the lock with trembling hands. She worked entirely by feel, her fingertips translating the minute resistance of each lever into information, adjusting, probing, pressing. The seconds stretched into minutes. Her knees ached against the cold stone floor. A sound from the far end of the corridor froze her solid. Footsteps, not the night footman. His tread was heavy and measured. These steps were light and quick. A woman's steps. Saren's fingers went still on the picks. She did not breathe. The footsteps came closer, accompanied by a faint rustle of fabric. Then they stopped. A door opened and closed. The morning room. Someone had entered the morning room. 20 feet from where she knelt. She waited. 1 minute. 2. The morning room door opened again, and the light, quick steps retreated back the way they had come, growing fainter until they were absorbed by the silence of the house. Saren let out a breath that seemed to empty her entirely. She returned to the lock. Her hands were steadier now, the fear having burned away and left behind a cold, clear focus. The 4th lever yielded. The 5th. The lock turned with a soft, decisive click. She eased the door open and slipped inside, pulling it closed behind her. The room smelled of dust and disuse, and beneath those stale scents something achingly familiar. Her father's tobacco. The particular blend of Latakia and Virginia that he had smoked in his evening pipe. It had been 2 years, and the ghost of it still lingered in the curtains, faint but unmistakable. It hit her like a blow. She stood in the darkness of her father's study, surrounded by the scent of him, and for one terrible moment her composure shattered. The tears came, silent and scalding. She pressed both hands over her mouth and wept without sound, her shoulders shaking with the effort of containing the grief that she had carried for 2 years, without ever once allowing it to surface. She gave herself 30 seconds. Then she wiped her face with her sleeve, drew a steadying breath, and lit the small taper she had brought with her, shielding the flame with her cupped hand. The study was exactly as she remembered it. The heavy mahogany desk, the leather chair with the cracked arm where her father used to rest his pipe, the bookcase along the far wall. the portrait of her mother above the fireplace, young and dark-haired and smiling. She searched the desk first. Nothing. She turned to the bookcase. Her father had loved hidden compartments, the scholar's fondness for concealment. She pulled volumes from the shelves, checking behind them, feeling for loose panels. The minutes bled away. Then her fingers found it. Behind a thick volume of Herodotus, the back panel of the shelf moved. Not much, 1/4 of an inch. But it moved. She pressed harder, and a section of the panel slid sideways, revealing a narrow cavity in the wall. Inside, wrapped in oilskin, was a sheaf of papers. Her hands shook so badly, she could barely unfold the wrapping. The taper flame danced wildly. She steadied it, held the papers to the light, and read. The first page was in her father's hand. It was a letter, dated 3 months before his death. "My dearest Seren," it began. "If you are reading this, then the worst has come to pass, and I am no longer here to protect you. I have placed my original will and testament in this hiding place because I no longer trust those around me." Seren's vision blurred. She blinked hard and forced herself to continue. "The will is clear. Everything I own, the house, the land, the investments, and my collection, belongs to you. Olaria has a life interest in the London property and an annual income that will keep her comfortable. Lavinia is provided for generously. But you, my darling girl, are my heir. Do not let anyone tell you otherwise. If a different will is produced after my death, it is a forgery. I have written to my friend Professor Greaves with instructions to contact you if I die. But I fear that letter, too, may be intercepted. Trust Greaves. Trust your own mind. And forgive me for not being braver while I lived. Beneath the letter was the will itself. Properly witnessed, properly signed, properly dated. And beneath that, a letter from the solicitor Kroll to Eularia, written a full year before the Viscount's death, discussing in blunt terms the possibility of producing a revised will that would redirect the inheritance. It was proof not merely of forgery, but of premeditation. Eularia had planned this before Seren's father was even cold. She wrapped the papers back in the oilskin and pressed them against her chest. She would take them. She would carry them out of this room and hide them somewhere Eularia could never find them, and then she would go to Ashworth Hall and she would find a way to use them. She turned towards the door. She took one step, and the door opened. Eularia stood in the doorway, a candle in her hand, her face illuminated from below like something from a painting of judgment. Her pale hair was loose around her shoulders. Her eyes were wide and utterly awake. She had not been asleep. She had been waiting. The two women stared at each other across the small dark room. The candle flames flickered between them like two small, uncertain souls. "I knew you would come," Eularia said. Her voice was very quiet. "I have been waiting for you to try this for months." Her gaze dropped to the oilskin packet pressed against Seren's chest, and something moved across her face that was darker and more dangerous than anger. It was fear. "Give me what you have found," Eularia said. Her voice was calm, but beneath the surface Seren could hear something fracturing. Seren did not move. She held the oilskin packet against her chest and felt the edges of the papers pressing into her skin through the fabric of her dress. Her father's words. Her father's will. Her future, thin as parchment and heavier than stone. "No," she said. The word hung in the air between them. It was the first time she had ever refused Eularia directly. Not deflected, not endured, not quietly absorbed. Refused. Eularia's expression shifted. "You are in my house," she said, taking a step into the room. "You are standing in a locked room that you entered without permission in the middle of the night. Whatever you think you have found, it will mean nothing. I will tell the magistrate you broke in. I will tell him you forged those papers yourself. Who do you imagine he will believe? a respected widow and mother, or a girl who was found creeping through locked doors at midnight. The threat was real. But Saren had an advocate now. "I am leaving for Ashworth Hall in 2 days," Saren said, and her voice was steadier than she had any right to expect. "The Dowager Duchess is expecting me. If I do not arrive, she will ask why. If I arrive with a story to tell, she will listen, and so will her son." The mention of the Duke changed the temperature of the room. Eularia's candle flame wavered. Her eyes moved from the packet to Saren's face, and Saren saw the calculation begin again, the rapid, cold assessment of options and outcomes that was her stepmother's particular genius. "You think they will take your side," Eularia said. "A duke you have met once, a dowager you spoke with for 20 minutes in a garden. Against the word of the woman who raised you." "You did not raise me," Saren said quietly. "My mother raised me. My father raised me. You endured me because you could not find a way to be rid of me that would not raise questions. And now I know why." Then Eularia did something unexpected. She laughed. It was a small, soft sound, devoid of warmth, but not entirely devoid of admiration. "You are more like your father than I gave you credit for," she said. "He was a stubborn man, too. He hid things. He made plans. He thought he was cleverer than everyone around him." She paused. "He was wrong. He was right about you," Saren said. The laughter died. Eularia's face hardened. "Give me the papers, Saren. Give them to me, and I will make you comfortable. I will settle a sum on you. You can go to Bath, to London, wherever you please. Take these papers to a solicitor, and what follows will destroy us all, Lavinia included. Is that what you want? To ruin your own sister?" It was the most dangerous weapon in Eularia's arsenal. Lavinia. The innocent, the beloved, the collateral damage. Saren felt the barbs sink in. But the will itself protected Lavinia. Her father had provided for her generously. The only person who would be ruined by the truth was Eularia. "Lavinia is provided for in the real will," Saren said. "You know that. Father loved her. He would never have left her with nothing. The only person who loses is you." Eularia's composure broke, not dramatically. It broke the way ice breaks, a single crack appearing across the surface, silent and irreversible. She suddenly looked older, diminished, a woman standing in the ruins of a plan that had taken years to construct. "You cannot prove the will was forged," she whispered. "Kroll is gone. The witnesses are gone. You have a piece of paper. I have 2 pieces of paper," Saren said. "The will and the letter from Kroll, discussing the forgery before Father was even dead. You planned this while he was still alive, while he was still sitting in this chair smoking his pipe, trusting you. That is what the magistrate will hear. That is what the Duke of Ashworth will hear. That is what the entire county will hear if you force my hand." Eularia said nothing. She stood in the doorway of her dead husband's study, and for the first time in Saren's memory she had no answer, no stratagem, no perfectly calibrated response. She was simply a woman who had been caught. Saren moved towards the door. Eularia did not step aside. For one long, breathless moment they stood face to face, close enough for Saren to see the pulse beating rapidly in her stepmother's throat, close enough to smell the jasmine perfume that she would forever associate with captivity. Then Eularia moved. She stepped back, pressing herself against the doorframe, and Saren passed through. She walked down the corridor, the oilskin packet gripped in both hands, and she did not look back. She climbed the stairs to her room. She closed the door. She hid the papers inside the lining of the old traveling case that had belonged to her mother, the case she would carry with her to Ashworth Hall. Then she sat on the edge of her bed and pressed her hands flat against her knees to stop them shaking. She had the proof, but the confrontation with Eularia had shown her something she had not fully understood until now. Her stepmother was not merely greedy or calculating. She was desperate, and desperate people were capable of anything. Saren did not sleep that night. She sat in the darkness and watched the door, and waited for the morning to come. The Ashworth carriage arrived at 10 o'clock on a bright Thursday morning. Saren descended the front steps with her head high and her heart hammering. Eulalia stood at the door, watching. She did not wave. She did not wish Saren well. She stood with her hands clasped at her waist, and her pale eyes fixed on the travelling case as it was loaded onto the carriage, and Saren knew with absolute certainty that her stepmother was thinking about what was hidden inside it. The carriage pulled away. Thornhollow Park receded through the rear window, growing smaller with each turn of the wheels, until it was nothing but a grey shape against the green hillside. Saren let out a breath she felt she had been holding for 3 years. Ashworth Hall revealed itself through a break in the trees after an hour's drive through rolling parkland. It was vast, far larger than Thornhollow, a great honey-coloured house of Portland stone with a classical facade and 2 sweeping wings that embraced a formal courtyard. The stone seemed to glow in the summer light, and the grounds were alive with mature trees and wildflower meadows and the distant gleam of a serpentine lake. The dowager met her in the entrance hall, which was airy and filled with light from a domed glass ceiling 2 stories above. She took both of Saren's hands and studied her face with those sharp blue eyes. "Why, you look tired, child," she said simply. "Come, there is tea, and there are books, and there is absolutely no one here who will make you manage their train." The week at Ashworth Hall was the most extraordinary of Saren's life. Each morning she was given the freedom of the Ashworth Library, a room that made the one at Thornhollow look like a cupboard, 2 vast stories of books, a gallery with a wrought iron balustrade, windows that flooded the space with light, and a silence so deep and welcoming it felt like being held. It was the first time in 2 years that she had been allowed to use her mind for its intended purpose, and the relief of it was so intense it was almost painful. The dowager joined her most afternoons. They discussed Cicero and Seneca. They argued about Thucydides. They laughed, and the sound of her own laughter startled Saren so much the first time it happened that she stopped mid-sentence, her hand flying to her mouth. "You have forgotten how the dowager observed, not unkindly. That is something we shall have to remedy." On the second morning, walking the grounds before breakfast, she found him. Lying in the shade of the stable yard, his great grey head resting on his paws, was the largest deerhound Saren had ever seen. He was long-limbed and shaggy, with eyes the colour of autumn smoke, and he lay with the particular stillness of a creature that has given up waiting for something it has lost. His name was Bracken, the dowager told her later. He was Rosanna's dog. Since her death, he has tolerated the staff but loved nothing and no one. He eats, he sleeps, he exists. But the light went out of him when she died, just as it went out of my son. Saren had gone back to the stable yard that afternoon. She sat on the low stone wall and said nothing. She did not call to him. She did not extend her hand. She simply sat in the warm silence and let herself be still. After several minutes, Bracken lifted his head. He studied her with those ancient, smoke-coloured eyes. Then, with the slow, deliberate movements of a very old soul making a very important decision, he rose, padded across the cobbles, and placed his chin on her knee. The weight of his head, the warmth of his breath through the fabric of her dress, the quiet trust of the gesture, broke something open inside her. She placed her hand on the rough grey fur between his ears, and he closed his eyes. A low, rumbling sound rose from his chest, not a growl, something deeper, something that sounded like the first breath after a long, long silence. The dowager, watching from a window above the yard, pressed her hand to her mouth. When she told Hadrian that evening, her voice was unsteady. She did not call to him, Dorothea said. She simply sat still. And he chose her. Just as he chose Rosanna. She paused. That dog knows something we do not, Hadrian. He always has. From that moment Bracken was Seren's shadow. He followed her through the house with a devotion so total and so sudden that it unsettled the staff and moved the dowager to quiet tears. He lay at her feet in the library. He walked beside her in the gardens. He slept outside her bedroom door, his great body curled across the threshold like a sentinel. The Duke was a more elusive presence. She saw him at meals, which were informal affairs taken in a small dining room. He was courteous, attentive, and visibly uncertain. The severe, commanding figure who had crossed the ballroom with such absolute purpose seemed, in his own home, younger and less sure of himself. He asked her about her reading. He listened to her answers with an intensity that was almost disconcerting. He did not flatter or flirt. He engaged with her ideas as if they mattered, as if she were a colleague rather than a curiosity. On the third evening after the dowager had retired early, they sat alone in the library. Bracken lay between them on the rug, his grey head resting on Seren's foot. The summer dusk poured through the tall windows, turning the room amber and gold. "May I ask you something?" Hadrian said at last. She looked up from her book. His grey eyes were serious, his expression stripped of its usual guarded composure. "Why did your father not protect you?" he asked. His voice was careful, as if the question had been weighed and measured many times before being spoken. The question pierced her. It was the question she had asked herself 1,000 times. "He tried," she said. "In his way. He was a scholar, not a fighter. He saw the world through books. He believed the truth would protect itself." She paused. "He was wrong about that. But he was not wrong about everything. He left provisions. He hid what he could. He wrote to those he trusted." She met his gaze. "He did not know how to fight, but he taught me how." Hadrian was silent for a long time. He did not look away from her. "My sister was like that," he said quietly. "She believed in people. She assumed the best. And she died. And I was left with the knowledge that believing in people is not enough, that sometimes you must act. When I received Professor Greaves' letter," he continued, "I told myself I was acting out of principle. And a wrong had been done. It was within my power to address it. It was simple." He paused. "It was not simple. It has not been simple. Since the moment I walked into that ballroom and saw you sitting in that chair. The honesty of it took her breath." He was not declaring love. He was admitting that his carefully ordered world, his defenses against feeling, had been disrupted by something he could not categorize or control. "I am not a man who acts on impulse," he said. "I am not a man who crosses ballrooms. But I looked at you, and I knew that Greaves was right, and I knew that if I did not move, I would regret it for the rest of my life." He stood up from his chair. "I tell you this not to burden you with expectations, but because I believe you deserve the truth. You have had so little of it." Seren rose too. They stood facing each other in the darkening library. Bracken, a warm grey shape between them. She could hear her own heartbeat. "I have something to show you," she said. "I brought papers from Thornhollow. My father's will, the real one, and proof that the one Eulario used was forged." His expression changed. The vulnerability vanished, replaced by the sharp, focused intensity she had seen in the ballroom. "Show me," he said. She went to her room and returned with the oilskin packet. She laid the papers on the library table, and he read them in silence, his grey eyes moving across each page with meticulous attention. He read her father's letter. He read the will. He read Kroll's damning correspondence with Eularia. When he finished, he placed both hands flat on the table and stood very still. "How long have you had these?" he asked. She told him everything. The hidden panel, the lockpicks, The midnight search. Eulalia in the doorway. The confrontation. The threats. And as she spoke, she felt the weight of 2 years of silence lifting from her shoulders, piece by piece, like stones being removed from a cairn. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, his expression held something she had never seen directed at herself. It was fury, a controlled, concentrated, aristocratic fury that was all the more terrifying for its quietness. "She threatened you," he said. "She stood in that doorway and threatened to have you arrested for entering your own father's study to retrieve your own father's will. Yes." He turned away and walked to the window. His hands were clasped behind his back, and she could see that they were not steady. "I will send for my solicitor tomorrow," he said. "His name is Aldrich Pemberton. He is the finest in London. He will examine these documents and advise on the strongest course of action." He turned back to face her. "In the meantime, these papers will be locked in my safe. Eulalia cannot reach them here." Sarah nodded. The relief was so vast it made her dizzy. He crossed the room to where she stood. He stopped an arm's length from her. His grey eyes searched her face with a tenderness that seemed to cost him something, as if each moment of softness was a concession wrested from a lifetime of self-discipline. "You will not go back to Thorn Hollow alone," he said. "When this is resolved, when your inheritance is restored, you will return as who you are. Miss Margaret Sarin Calloway, daughter of Viscount Calloway, mistress of your own home and your own future." He paused. "And you will not return unaccompanied." "I will be there, if you will permit it." She understood. He was not simply offering legal assistance. He was telling her in the only language his character would allow that she mattered to him, and that he would stand beside her, not because it was just, but because he could no longer imagine standing anywhere else. "Thank you," she whispered. It was insufficient, but it was all she could manage without breaking, and breaking was something she had promised herself she would not do. "Not yet." He nodded once. Then he turned and left the library. At Saren's feet, Bracken lifted his head and watched the Duke go, then settled again with a low, satisfied rumble, as if something long awaited had finally been set right. The solicitor arrived 2 days later. Aldrich Pemberton was a lean, sharp-featured man, with silver at his temples and the quiet, relentless demeanor of someone who had spent 30 years dismantling frauds. He examined the documents with the reverence of a scholar handling a first edition. He asked Saren precise questions about the circumstances of her father's death, the appearance of the revised will, the behavior of Eulalia over the past 2 years. When he had finished, he looked at Hadrian. "The case is strong," he said. "The original will is properly executed. The letter from Kroll is devastating. Miss Calloway's inheritance should be restored in its entirety." "And the fraud," Hadrian said. Pemberton chose his words carefully. "That is a criminal matter. If Miss Calloway wishes to pursue charges, the evidence supports it, but a criminal prosecution will be public, prolonged, and deeply unpleasant. Your sister will be affected." "I do not wish to prosecute," Saren said. "I wish to recover what is mine and to ensure that Lavinia is cared for. Beyond that, I want only the truth to be known, not in a courtroom, in the house where it happened." Hadrian looked at Saren. "Where?" he asked. "Thorn Hollow," she said. It must be at Thorn Hollow. They returned to Thorn Hollow Park on a Tuesday afternoon in late July. The Ashworth carriage came first, carrying Saren and the Dowager. Behind it came a second carriage carrying the Duke and Aldrich Pemberton. Behind that, a third, carrying the Duke's personal secretary and a clerk. The arrival of 3 carriages bearing the Ashworth crest caused a sensation in the household. Servants appeared at windows. The front door was flung open, and Eulalia, summoned by the commotion, emerged onto the front steps in a state of visible alarm that she was struggling to conceal. She had not expected this. She had expected Saren to return alone. "Your Grace," she said, addressing the dowager with a smile that did not reach her eyes. "What a wonderful surprise!" The dowager descended from the carriage with the unhurried elegance of a woman who had been entering and exiting grand houses for 7 decades. She did not return the smile. "We require the use of your drawing room, Mrs. Calloway," she said. "There is a matter that needs to be discussed." Eularia's gaze moved from the dowager to Hadrian, who was emerging from the second carriage with Pemberton at his side. She looked at the solicitor's leather case, at the clerk carrying a portable writing desk, at the formal, grave expressions on every face. And Saren watched the understanding dawn, watched the precise moment when Eularia realized what was about to happen. Her stepmother's face did not crumble, it froze. She stepped aside from the doorway without another word and led them into the house. The drawing room was arranged quickly. Chairs were placed. The clerk set up his desk. Lavinia, drawn by the commotion, appeared in the doorway with wide, frightened eyes. Saren went to her and took her hand. "You should be here," she said gently. "I will explain everything. I promise you this is not meant to hurt you." "What is happening?" Lavinia whispered. "The truth," Saren said. "It is only the truth." They sat. The dowager took a chair near the window. Hadrian stood behind Saren's chair, a silent, immovable presence. It was Hadrian who spoke first. He addressed Eularia directly, his voice carrying the quiet, absolute authority of a man who had never been disobeyed. "Mrs. Calloway," he said, 2 years ago, upon the death of your husband, Viscount Calloway, a will was entered into probate that placed the entirety of the family estate and fortune under your sole control. That will was a forgery." The word landed in the room like a stone thrown through glass. Lavinia gasped. Eularia did not move. Hadrian continued. "The original will, executed by the Viscount and properly witnessed, has been recovered from a hidden compartment in his private study. It names his elder daughter, Miss Margaret Saren Calloway, as his principal heir. Generous provision is made for his younger daughter, Miss Lavinia. A life interest in the London property and an annual income are settled upon you. The original will is just and fair. The forged will is a criminal fraud." He nodded to Pemberton, who laid the documents on the table between Eularia and Saren. The original will, the letter from Kroll, the letter from the Viscount to Saren, each one placed with deliberate precision. Eularia stared at the papers. Her face was grey. The porcelain mask, the jasmine-scented composure, the lethal charm that had governed every interaction for 3 years, all of it was gone. What remained was a woman sitting in a room full of people who knew exactly what she had done, with no strategy left, no lie sufficient, no angle of attack remaining. Lavinia was weeping silently, her hand still clasped in Saren's. She looked from the papers to her mother. "Mama," she said, her voice breaking. "Is it true?" The silence stretched, agonizing, interminable. Every person in the room held their breath. "Yes," Eularia said at last. The word was barely audible, a whisper scraping against the bottom of a ruined voice. "Yes, it is true." Lavinia's sob was the only sound in the room. Saren tightened her grip on her sister's hand and did not let go. Pemberton stepped forward and explained the terms. The forged will would be voided, the original will would be submitted to probate, the estate and all assets would be transferred to Saren. Lavinia's provision would be honored in full. Eularia would retain the life interest and annual income specified in the original will. There would be no criminal prosecution. This was Saren's decision, and Pemberton made it clear that it was a mercy, not an obligation. Eularia listened with her eyes fixed on the floor. When Pemberton finished, she looked up, not at Saren, not at the Duke or the Dowager. She looked at Lavinia. "I did it for you," she said. Her voice was hollow, Everything I did was for you." Lavinia pulled her hand from Saren's and stood. She crossed the room to her mother and knelt beside her chair. She took Eularia's hands. "Mama," she said, her tear-streaked face fierce with a sudden, blazing clarity, "you did it for yourself. You told yourself it was for me, because that made it bearable. But I never asked for it. I never wanted it. Not like this." She looked back at Saren. "I would rather have had nothing and known the truth than everything and lived a lie." It was the bravest thing Saren had ever heard anyone say. It was also, she realized, the moment she truly understood her sister. Lavinia was not the shallow, sheltered creature Eularia had tried to create. She was their father's daughter, just as Saren was. The goodness was in her bones. Eularia broke then. Not with drama, she simply folded. Her shoulders curved inward, her head dropped, and she wept, quietly, helplessly, without defense. The tears of a woman who had wagered everything on a lie and lost. Saren watched her stepmother cry, and she felt many things. Anger, yes. Relief, certainly. But also, somewhere beneath the wreckage of 3 years of suffering, something she had not expected to feel. A thin, reluctant thread of pity, not forgiveness. Not yet, perhaps not ever, but pity, for a woman who had been so consumed by fear and ambition that she had destroyed the very family she claimed to be protecting. She looked up at Hadrian. He was watching her, his grey eyes soft with an emotion he no longer tried to conceal. He gave her the smallest nod, an acknowledgement not of victory, but of something harder won. She had chosen justice over vengeance, truth over retribution, and he had understood. The arrangements were made quietly. Eularia would depart for the London property within the week. Pemberton would handle the legal transfer. Lavinia had gone to sit with her mother in the small parlour where 2 women who barely knew each other were beginning the painful work of an honest conversation. Saren walked out of the drawing-room and through the great hall and out onto the front steps of Thornhollow Park. The evening air was warm and scented with cut grass and roses, her father's roses blooming in the garden he had planted in the grounds of the house that was now, finally, hers. She sat down on the top step and pressed her hands flat against the cool stone and breathed. Footsteps behind her. She did not need to turn around. She knew the sound of his stride, as familiar to her now as her own heartbeat. Hadrian sat down beside her on the step, a Duke of Ashworth, sitting on a stone step in the twilight. There was something absurd about it, something wonderful. They sat in silence for a long time. The sky deepened from gold to rose to violet. A blackbird sang from the copper beech at the edge of the lawn. "Are you well?" he asked at last. "I do not know," she said. She was being honest. The magnitude of what had been returned to her had not yet settled into reality. "I think I will be, but not tonight." He nodded. He did not try to rush her. He simply sat beside her, a steady, warm, patient presence, and let her be exactly where she was. "I owe you a debt I cannot repay," she said. "You owe me nothing," he said. His voice was quiet and certain. "I did not come here for gratitude. Why did you come?" she asked. She already knew the answer, but she wanted to hear him say it. He turned to face her. In the fading light, the severity of his features had softened into something almost gentle. His grey eyes held hers, and for once there was no guard, no reserve, no careful distance maintained. "I crossed the ballroom," he said. That should have been answer enough, but in case it was not, he paused, and she saw the ghost of a smile, the first real smile she had ever seen on his face, and it transformed him entirely. "I came because I recognized you. Not your name, not your history. You. The woman who sat in a ridiculous gilt chair in a 2-season old dress and looked at the world with the clearest eyes I've ever seen. I crossed the room because I had no choice. Because everything in me said that if I did not, I would spend the rest of my life wishing I had. She felt the tears come then, not the sharp, stinging tears of grief or frustration that she had held back for so long. These were different. They were warm. They were the tears of a woman who had been seen, truly and completely seen, and had not had to pretend to be anything other than herself to earn it. She did not speak. She reached out and took his hand. He laced his fingers through hers, and his grip was firm and warm and steady, and they sat together on the steps of Thornhollow Park as the first stars appeared above the garden, and the blackbird finished its song, and the roses breathed their sweetness into the darkening air. 1 year later, the wedding took place at the small stone church in the village below Ashworth Hall. It was not the grand society event that the county had expected. It was quiet, attended by those who mattered, and no one who did not. The dowager sat in the front pew, her sharp blue eyes suspiciously bright. Professor Greaves, now very frail but very determined, had made the journey from London and sat beside her, beaming. Lavinia, radiant in pale yellow, stood as Saren's attendant, her face alight with a joy that was entirely uncompromised. Saren wore a gown of ivory silk, simple and beautiful, and carried a bouquet of roses from Thornhollow's garden, the same roses her father had planted decades ago. She walked down the aisle alone. She had no one to give her away, and she had decided that she did not need anyone to. She was giving herself freely and entirely, and that was enough. Hadrian stood at the altar and watched her come towards him. His face was still severe. His bearing was still that of a man carved from authority and duty, but his eyes, those pale grey eyes that had found her across a crowded room and refused to look away, were shining with a warmth so profound that several of the older women in the congregation reached for their handkerchiefs. The vows were spoken, the ring was placed, and when the vicar pronounced them married, the Duke of Ashworth did something that no one in the county had ever seen him do. He smiled. A full, unreserved, incandescent smile that broke across his face like sunlight through cloud, and the congregation let out a collective breath, because in that smile was the visible evidence of a man returned to life. They emerged from the church into a September afternoon of golden light and warm breeze. The villagers had gathered along the path, throwing dried lavender and rose petals. At the lich gate, sitting with the patient dignity of a very old and very wise creature, was Bracken, the great grey deerhound who had belonged to no one since Rosanna died, until a quiet, still woman had sat on a stable-yard wall and let him come to her. In his own time he rose now and padded forward to meet them. He pushed his enormous head between their joined hands, and Saren laughed, a full, free, unguarded sound that rang across the churchyard like a bell. Hadrian looked at his wife, laughing in the September sunshine, with rose petals in her dark hair, and a deerhound nudging her hip, and the whole of their future stretching out before them. He thought of the ballroom. He thought of the gilt chair. He thought of the letter from an old professor that had pierced his solitude and set all of this in motion. He thought of his sister who had believed in people, who had assumed the best, and who would have loved Saren with her whole fierce heart. And he understood at last what Rosanna had tried to teach him all along, that the measure of a life is not what you protect yourself from, it is what you allow yourself to feel. It is the ballroom you are willing to cross, the silence you are willing to break, the hand you are willing to reach for, when every instinct tells you to keep your distance. He had crossed, he had broken, he had reached. And on the other side, waiting with clear eyes and quiet courage, and a heart that had endured everything the world could throw at it and remained unbroken, was Saren, his wife, his Duchess, his home.